Hello everyone, my name is Yain Velasco and today I will be presenting on the exposure to bisphenol A and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder amongst kids. So to start off, I want to go ahead and introduce my outline. It will include an introduction and background, my methodology, my research and discussion, which will go into further detail with BPA exposure, the effects of bisphenol A on ADHD, prenatal bisphenol A exposure on childhood behavior, and cognitive function in children ages, as well as my conclusion. So to start off with the introduction, so I have listed some key points of my given topic. And did any of you know that the exposure to chemicals during pregnancy can significantly influence a child's future behavior and cognitive abilities? So if you didn't, today we're going to discuss how prenatal exposure to bisphenol A, BPA, a chemical commonly found in plastics, may contribute to the development of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or also known as ADHD in children. So some of the key points in this topic is the environmental variables. So chemical exposures during critical development stages contribute to ADHD development, which means that the study suggests that prenatal BPA exposure can cause neurological disruptions that lead to ADHD-related symptoms like hyperactivity, impulsivity, and cognitive difficulties. Um, Also, we want to take into consideration that there could be potential links amongst ADHD and symptoms in early childhood, as mentioned by Braun in 2017. Behavioral issues such as hyperactivity, impulsivity, and cognitive effects associated with BPA were found in a study by Wang. And I also want to introduce that there are different impacts among sex genders. So boys have demonstrated to show higher levels of ADHD and related behaviors as in comparison to girls, which means that ADHD is affecting more boys than it is girls. And I will go into further detail amongst my methodology and my research and discussion. So this is just a little bit about the topic. So my methodology overview. So my research approaches and methods. So the studies that I focused on throughout this research were on comparative studies, systematic review and meta-analysis, behavioral and cognitive studies, survey-based research studies, and a study that focused on logistic regression analysis. So to go more into detail with that, the comparative studies first, including the cross-sectional case controlled and clinical investigations, were conducted to measure BPA levels in children. These approaches helped identify patterns and relationships across the diverse groups, as noted by Baycal in 2023. Moving forward to the systematic review and meta-analysis, um, a systematic review following the OHAT framework examined prenatal and postnatal BPA exposure in children as young as 3 months old. This framework ensured that a thorough evidence-based review of BPA's impact and on the neurodevelopment stages of children. Um, Also, moving forward to behavior and cognitive studies, we examined the link between prenatal BPA exposure and cognitive functions. So, several studies explored how BPA exposure affects children in cognitive functions and social responses, and looked into more of their impairments, focusing on behavioral outcomes more so in 7 to 9-year-olds based on the data from the cohort study. And then the survey-based research, they used the National Health and Nutrition Examination to analyze exposure in US children among ages 8 to 15 using the logistic regression, which helped examine the linkage between the urinary tests that they did and BPA concentrations and the prevalence of ADHD. So the logistic regression analysis allowed for the relationship to be explored further and to see the outcomes of ADHD and the risk factors of this diverse population. So these methodologies provide a multi-faced approach to understanding the linkage between BP and ADHD and give it a more direct observational data perspective and statistical analysis, so that it is, important to conclude that the methodology helped um, see the linkage between both of these topics. Moving on to my research and discussion, we have BPA exposure and hyperactivity disorder in the US amongst children, and then the effects of bisphenol A on ADHD. So just to briefly cover on that, the purpose of the survey in the United States was done by the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and it pretty much took children within the ages of 8 to 15 to assess health biomarkers related to BPA exposures. And we had the 50% of 8 to 11-year-olds participate and 33% of 12 to 15-year-olds participate, mentioned in the study. And basically, the study involved random sampling to get a diverse representation of the children within the age group. And then ADHD symptoms and BPA exposure, one of the most striking findings was that 84% of participants exhibited potential ADHD symptoms. The analysis of urine samples revealed 3 levels of BPA exposure in these children, also which were traced primarily to like the consumption of food items at home, or things, plastic materials at home. Descriptive statistics showed that children with detectable BPA levels in their urine were at an increased risk for developing ADHD compared to those who did not have any detectable levels. And then going back to the gender differences, the study also found a significant gender disparity. So the correlation between BPA exposure and ADHD was 3 times higher in boys compared to girls. And also that this suggests that boys are probably more vulnerable to neurodevelopmental effects because of BPA. And moving forward to the effects of bisphenol A, BPA on ADHD, how it emerges, the ADHD affects core cognitive functions such as attention, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. These areas are critical for children's developmental, academic, and social development. So the study highlighted the role of environmental factors in ADHD development, such as key exposures like fetal exposure, alcohol, cigarette smoke, plastics, and just anything that is found in plastics such as BPA. And then the studies also found that the prenatal and postnatal exposure to environmental agents comparing children with adolescents um, found that it was significantly increased ADHD risk, particularly in children who already had pre-existing cognitive disorders. So it enhanced that. It enhances the reaction that they have and how their neurological system continues to work. Um, Moving forward to prenatal bisphenol A exposure and children behavior, a bit of about this is, some global insights. This was a study done in China which is, the largest producer and consumer of BPA with a 20% of global production. And some of the findings that we found here were the study showed that prenatal exposure to BPA is linked to behavioral and cognitive issues in children. And even though these effects can vary differently, depending on the child's gender or depending on pre-existing conditions. They found that BPA's effects on neural development are often more sex specific, and also found that children exposed to the highest levels of BPA during pregnancy were at a 77% more likely to have self-control problems and 39% more likely to have difficulties thinking or planning. So this study demonstrated these percentages in terms of the study that they conducted in China, which is the largest plastic producer. And then some assessment tools that they used were to measure these effects, where researchers used behavioral rating inventory of executive function, which is also considered or known as BRIEF. It was an assessment to evaluate key areas such as emotional control, planning, working memory, and social behaviors to try and see the differences amongst these children and what areas they were being affected more often. And then another study also mentioned timing and outcomes, which was that demonstrated that BPA exposure is critical in timing. So, for instance, higher BPA levels at age 4 were linked with poor social responsiveness and executive functioning, whereas once they are older, they performed a little bit, um, uh, children performed a little bit worse. So boys performed a little bit worse than girls. This suggests that both the timing and the child's gender plays a crucial role in determining how BPA affects neurodevelopment um, amongst children. And then moving on to cognitive function in children ages 3 to 10, I just want to briefly hit subject on this, and this study focused primarily on the relationship between BPA and the impact on the children's behavior, and specifically examined how it may affect boys and girls, and how it continues to look different. So one of the main goals of the study was to explore whether the behavioral outcomes of BPA exposure differ between boys and girls, and how challenging it is. Previous studies had shown a little bit of mixed reviews, but this study actually demonstrated that um, children in or girls within the ages 3 to 5 were showing less issues than what boys were showing. So again, we go back to how boys are more likely to be exposed to BPA and have more difficulties and challenges with their reactions and behavior regulation, especially after being exposed to BPA. And then to end my presentation, I just want to emphasize on some of the key subjects that we talked about, especially because I'm trying to keep it very short and concise. Um, so just some things that I wanted to mention are that BPA and ADHD are linked through prenatal BPA exposure, and are increased at risk of ADHD in school-age children that are already having difficulties um, with behavior. So stronger effect in boys is what I noticed among this research. Boys seem to be more affected by BPA exposure, especially during prenatal development and early school years. So they more than girls, so they tend to have a harder time focusing. So cognitive and focus issues, BPA exposure impacts cognitive abilities and the ability to concentrate in children, but mostly amongst boys. Um, and then especially in gender differences, there was no actual clear reason as to why girls are less affected, despite the actual direct effect as well as boys, which means that there needs to be further research, which is why I added public health implications. More research is needed to explore why BPA affects boys more and identify potential interventions. I know there's already legislation to reduce BPA-related ADHD outcomes. Um, or at least to reduce the exposure to plastic, but there has not been a research study found yet that will like will focus on this primarily. But yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Here are my references. I look forward to hearing from all of your guys' presentations and your guys' research studies that you guys found.